Hello, Dave.
Hey, how you doing, Chris? Nice to see you.
Likewise, likewise. Very glad to have you onto the podcast. I wanted to get you on because you've written a biography of one of my favorite boxers, which is Marvelous Marvin Hagler. And I really want to get to a deep dive about his life because a lot of people know about his career, especially his professional career. But in terms of his personal life, he was seemed to be very secretive with regards to that. So I want to get into a deep dive with all of that. But first things first, before I begin, I say to the majority of my guests, just explain who you are and your journey up to writing this book.
Sure. So first of all, thanks for having me. It's great to be on. So look, I grew up in Brockton, which is Marvin Hagler's hometown. So as a little kid, I grew up, watching him fight and heard about how great he was. And my dad actually knew Rocky Marciano, who also grew up in Brockton. So I grew up with boxing in my blood, really, in the town, in the city where I grew up. I never really did a lot with sports as far as media goes, but I worked in newspapers for many years and I covered crime. I was a news reporter for the Boston Herald for 14 years. And then I left in 2013 and started writing books. My first book was a book called Boston Strong, which was about the Boston Marathon bombing attacks.
Okay.
And that book got turned into the movie Patriots Day, the Mark
Okay.
Wahlberg film. And so after that, I just was mostly writing books for the next several years. I've written 8 books, and a couple of years ago, I was kind of thinking about what to do next. And Brockton police officer friend of mine said, "You know what? There's an untold story about Marvin. A lot of people don't know Marvin Hagler's personal story for the reasons you said that he was pretty secretive, and also." Everyone knows about the Sugar Ray Leonard fight and Tommy Hearns and Roberto Duran, but no one really knows how Marvin got to that point. So, and also they don't know the story of his relationship with the Petronelli brothers, which is his two trainers. So that was the story I set out to tell in this book was how did Marvin Hagler become marvelous?
Okay, cool. We'll get to that in a minute because the Marvelous nickname has an interesting story in itself. But
Yes.
you said that you obviously came from the same town that Adler came from, but you actually moved there initially. Initially, it was in Newark, New Jersey. So,
Mhm.
what was his upbringing like before he moved to Brockton?
So that's a big part of my story, and that's another reason why I wrote the book because a lot of people don't know the story of his journey. So he was born in Newark, New Jersey, grew up in Newark, and Newark in the late 1960s was a very segregated city. It was very violent. There was a lot of crime, and when America had the horrible, the long hot summer of '67, which was some of the worst riots that America had ever seen, even to this day. Newark was really one of the worst cities for that. 27 people were killed in Newark during the summer of 1967, all right in Marvin Hagler's neighborhood. And him and his family were actually trapped in their house. They had no dad. The dad had abandoned the family, and the mother was with Marvin and his 5 younger brothers and sisters. They were literally prisoners in the home for several days while these riots unfolded outside their windows. There was fires, people getting shot. The police were, lining the streets. It was a very dangerous, dangerous time. Finally, Marvin's mother decided it was time to make a change, and she had a relative in Brockton, and she decided to move the family up to Brockton, and she was able to get out in 1969. A couple years after that, there was some more riots in '69. And that was really the straw that broke the camel's back, and she decided enough is enough. I don't want to lose my babies. I'm going to move, so they moved up to Brockton.
Just going back to that rise, he said him and his Hagler and his family were held up in the house for a few days. Do you know Bullet actually was shot into the house and did he like nearly miss him as it?
Yeah, that's right. So they were literally on the floor hiding because and they had all the lights off because it was martial law. And if people turned the lights on and they saw people walking around in apartments, the police would shoot up into the houses because they thought they were snipers because there were snipers in a lot of houses on rooftops and stuff shooting at the police. So one of their uncles was over and all the kids were on the grounds laying down staying quiet, and the uncle was walking around and he had lit a candle, and someone, we don't know who, but someone shot up into the apartment, and several bullets came ricocheting through the house while all the kids were there covering their heads, cowering for safety. Very, very terrible moment for Marvin and his family, and Marvin talked about it quite a bit, as you know, in interviews as he got older.
Okay, cool. So they moved to Brockton, Massachusetts. And how old was Hagler when he moved up to Brockton?
So he was 15 when he moved to Brockton, and you know, they moved in with some relatives, and you know, he really didn't know what he wanted to do with his life. He had dropped out of school by that time. He had a girlfriend in Newark that he was helping her raise her child, and he was working full time at helping his mother pay the bills and feed his brothers and sisters. When they got to Brockton, he started working for a construction company, and he was at a party one night, and that's where Marvin Hagler's future changed. Was he was at a party with a bunch of other teenagers, and he talked to the wrong girl, and he got into a fight with a guy named Dornell Wigfall. And Dornell Wigfall is really the reason why Marvelous Marvin Hagler exists today, because Dornell Wigfall was a big, tough football player, American football for Brockton High School, which at the time was a real powerhouse in New England football, one of the biggest schools in America, 5,000 students, and they had a great football team. And Dornell was a star that was actually being scouted by the New England Patriots to play for them. And Dornell, Marvin made the mistake of talking to Dornell's girlfriend or a girl that he was with, and they fought. And Marvin was on the losing end of that fight. He got beat up pretty bad, had to go to the hospital, had a swollen jaw, broken tooth, and he vowed from that moment forward that he was never going to get beat up again. And that's what really started Marvin on his journey to boxing.
So wasn't one of the things that started with boxing was when he started working for the construction company because the two brothers that owned it?
That's correct. The two brothers that owned it were Goody and Pat Petronelli, and they also ran a boxing gym. And Goody Petronelli was a really close friend of Rocky Marciano. And when they opened the gym in Brockton in the late 60s, their partner was supposed to be Rocky Marciano. So in 1969, Marvin and his family moved to Brockton. A month before that, Rocky Marciano had been killed in the plane crash in Iowa, that everybody knows that story. Goody and Pat Petronelli at that time were wondering what their future was, because here was Rocky Marciano, who was supposed to be their partner in the gym, which would have brought in a lot of business and they would have got big fighters. All of a sudden, they don't have him anymore. He died in a plane crash. So they're mourning the loss of their friend, wondering about their own future. And a few months later, a young Marvin Hagler walks into their gym. Little did they know he was their future. At the time, he was just another kid off the streets, but he didn't even know what he wanted to do. And but pretty quickly, he showed that he wanted to fight, and Goody and Pat and Marvin built a pretty incredible friendship.
You say Hagler went into the gym to box, but I remember reading somewhere, I might have been mistaken, a few years ago where initially Hagler just went to the gym. He didn't even compete. He just sat there and
That's right. Yeah.
most trainers would go and actually try and encourage, but Goody could actually see that this person was traumatized. Do you know what specifically to traumatized? So just let him stay there until eventually Hagler of his own accord actually started hitting the bags. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so what happened was there was another gym in Brockton. It was the Ward 5 gym, which was where Dornell Wigfall trained. And Marvin originally started going there after that fight with Dornell. He said, you know, because the gym was right across the street from where Marvin lived at the time. And he went into that gym, and that was run by a guy named Vinny Vecchione, who went on to train a lot of boxers, and including Peter McNeely, who fought Mike Tyson. Vinny Vecchione was a gangster. It was a mafia controlled sort of gym. Marvin went in there and he sat there for several days, and no one ever came and talked to him. So he left, and he walked over to the gym around the corner, which was Petronelli Gym. And when he walked in there, he wasn't there very long before Goody took an interest in him and asked him, "What are you here for, son?" And Marvin said, "I want to fight." And they started talking and they started working out. And the Goody ended up asking him his famous story that Marvin used to tell. He said, "Well, what do you really want, son?" He said, "I want to be middleweight champion of the world." And Goody said, "Well, I'll be your trainer." And that's how they started.
Okay. So what was Hagler's amateur record like?
I believe he was 51-1, I believe ended up being his amateur record. And he fought he was thinking about going to the Olympics in 1976. There was talk of him being put on the Olympic team. I'm sorry, 72, the 72 team. And but at that time, remember, he had no father. His mother was on welfare, you know, on government assistance with all the kids, you know, five younger brothers and sisters. and Marvin's working full time, he said, "I can't go to the Olympics. I can't go fight for free. A gold medal is not going to pay for my groceries." So he went pro. He turned pro in 1973, and that's when he started fighting pro. And one of his first fights was against Dornell Wigfall, one of his first pro fights. And that's where he actually got his revenge on Dornell Wigfall. He beat him in that first fight.
When you say beating, was that on points or via knockout?
I believe he beat him in the eighth round. I think the fight was stopped. I believe I'd have to check that. But it was I believe it was an 8-round fight that Marvin won.
Did any promoters early on in Hagler's career show an interest in signing him?
Yeah, so he was with the Petronelli brothers from the beginning, and they built a really, a lot of trust. They called themselves the Triangle, where Goody was the trainer, Marvin was the fighter, and Pat Petronelli was the manager, where he dealt with all the business side of things. Um, but the problem was, no one knew who Marvin was, and no one really knew who the Petronelli brothers were. They hadn't had any really big fighters in their career. And so no matter how much Marvin won, he couldn't get big fights. So he was just fighting all around New England to try to get some big fights, get televised fights and make some money. And eventually he had to go to Philadelphia because at that time that's where the best middleweights in the country were fighting. There was 4 guys down there. Willie the Worm Monroe, Bad Benny Briscoe, a guy named Cyclone Hart, and then another guy named Boogaloo Watts, and they were all really, really tough guys. Like, Marvin said later in his career that Cyclone Hart was one of the hardest punches he had ever fought in his life. So Marvin had to go down to Philadelphia to fight these guys, and he lost his first 2 fights in Philadelphia. So no promoters wanted him. In fact, Russell Peltz, who was a famous promoter in the 80s and 90s and the 70s, was offered a piece of Marvin to help be his promoter by Goody and Pat, and Russell turned it down. And it's a story that he tells all the time because little did he know Marvin went on to be, arguably the greatest middleweight of all time, or one of them. And he always says, I turned down a chance to own a piece of Marvelous Marvin Hagler. So, and as time went on and Marvin's career grew, there were a lot of promoters that tried to steal him away from Goody and Pat, including Don King and Bob Arum, and they all wanted a piece of Marvin, but Marvin was very loyal to Goody and Pat his whole life.
Yeah. Before we
That's a big
talk
part
about
of my
your,
book is that loyalty.
before we talk about the whole Philadelphia scene and get into depth with that, again, I remember reading somewhere that Hagler said, and bear in mind, this is someone who's fought the likes of Alan Minter, Sugar Ray Leonard, Tommy Hearns, Roberto John. He said the hardest opponent he ever had was actually a British fighter named Kevin Finnegan,
That's
which
right.
I've
Yeah.
not been able to get any coverage of, unfortunately. Although I have seen Kevin Finnegan fight in other fights. We fought Minter. But what was it about Finnegan that Hagler thought made him so hard to face?
Well, I think Kevin Finnegan was just a really tough guy. He was a hard puncher. He was a barroom brawler. But he was also a very sophisticated guy. He was a phenomenal artist. But he turned out to be a terrible alcoholic as well. Um, but him and Marvin had, I believe they fought at least 2 times, and I think Kevin Finnegan fought Alan Minter, I believe 3 times. And British boxing fans like yourself know that, those are some of the most legendary British fights of all time. A lot of people compare them to, what happened here in the States with Mickey Ward and Arturo Gotti. They were just wars. And those fights that Marvin Hagler had with Kevin Finnegan were pretty violent episodes. I believe Marvin broke his jaw in one of them and sent him into the hospital here in Boston. But Marvin did always say that Finnegan was one of the hardest fighters he ever fought.
What was it about the Philadelphia scene that made the fighters so tough there? You've named the main four, but
Mm.
there seemed to be just a tough Philadelphia scene in the 70s. What was it about that city that made those fighters not just tough, but world-class fighters from that small area?
Well, I think Joe Louis, I mean, Joe Louis was one of the most famous fighters from Philadelphia, and his gym down there was a world-class gym after Joe Louis became the heavyweight world champion. And I think it grabbed, all those fighters I named, all 4 of those guys, I believe all 4 of them came from other parts of the country. At least 3 of them did. They moved from different areas, and they, their families moved them up to Philadelphia for different reasons, and they all gravitated towards that gym because it was such a great gym. The other thing that was going on in Philly at that time was, like a lot of American cities, there was a lot of crime and a lot of violence, a lot of poverty, and the police officers didn't have a lot of things to do with the young kids. So a lot of times they would find these kids that, maybe got into some trouble, got in a street fight or something like that. But they seemed like, the cops kind of felt maybe he's a good kid. They would bring him to Joe Lewis's gym, and Joe Lewis and his trainers would help these kids that wanted to have a shot at, not being a criminal. And that's why that gym was so successful, because they took a lot of young, tough kids off the street.
Of the four Philadelphia fighters you mentioned, was it not Bobby Watts, Willie Monroe when they fought the first time? Monroe got the decision, but a lot of people thought that was actually a robbery and Hagler should have won it.
Yeah, that's right. It was a terrible decision. I wasn't there, but
Mm.
from all the research I did for this book, it was a terrible decision. And in fact, the Philadelphia papers made kind of light of it and called it a robbery. They said Marvin Hagler came to Philadelphia and got robbed. Um, he was not treated very fairly down there by the press, or in those early days, or by the judges. And he always, and Goody and Pat talked about that decision a lot over the years as Marvin's career went on, that he really lost a very terrible decision.
While all this is going on, while he's fighting Philadelphia, how is his family back in Brockton? How are they getting on?
So he was traveling back and forth, and they didn't have much money. He was only making $2,000-3,000 a fight at that point, and not a bad day if it's all going to you. But he had, Goody and Pat had to be paid all the travel expenses, all the training, so he wasn't making a lot of money. And again, his mother's back home with the five younger siblings, and she was working part time when she could. She worked cleaning houses, but she relied on government assistance a lot. And Brockton was not as bad as Newark, but it had its own issues. It had its own crime and things like that. So the family struggled a bit, and there was definitely a lot of difficult times in those early days. And then Marvin started, seeing his future wife Bertha, who was a teenage mom that lived in their neighborhood in Brockton, and he pretty soon built a relationship with her, and they started their own family.
What did his mum think of Hagler um, basically having boxing as a career?
So she's funny. She said that she never felt that he wanted to box. She thought he was going to be a baseball player, or something like that. But she was very tough on Marvin when he was young, and told him, when he would go outside, if you get bullied, you better fight back. If I find out you didn't fight back, you're going to be in big trouble. And don't come home if you got bullied and didn't stand up for yourself. So she was a tough woman. She was a church going woman. She tried to instill good values in those kids, and I think she did, because Marvin and his brother Robbie Sims, who went on to be a world class prize fighter on his own. He also fought Tommy Hearns and other folks. I'm sorry, Duran. He fought, not Hearns. But I think she taught those kids how to survive in a very difficult world where they were brought up without a father figure.
So Hagler's facing his Philadelphia fighters and he slowly, surely starts to get the better of them as well. When do people start to take notice nationally and internationally that actually this Hagler is a world-class middleweight?
So he beat a lot of great fighters throughout the years. Kevin Finnegan being one of them. And he eventually got to he finally got his shot at the title. Well, I should back up actually, because there was a big part of the story in my book. I don't want to give the whole book away, but a big part of the story was in 1977. Don King launched what he called the Tournament of Champions, and in 1977, America was riding high from the '76 Olympics, where Leon Spinks and Sugar Ray Leonard and all these great boxers won gold medals, and America was really in love with boxing. Remember, 1976 was also the year that Rocky came out. And you talk about Philadelphia, the fighting city of Philadelphia, that movie encapsulated that spirit. And America had a love affair with boxing in those late 70s. So Don King wanted to cash in on that, and he created this Tournament of Champions. The problem was it was rigged. Everybody in the tournament either was one of Don King's fighters, or they were basically told they had to be or they couldn't be in it. Marvin wouldn't sign with Don King, so he was excluded from that tournament. And the funny part about it is when you read the rankings, Marvin had beat almost everyone on them, multiple times, some of them, and knocked most of them out. So it became pretty clear that the whole thing was kind of fraudulent. There ended up being a big investigation into it, and it was found to be fraudulent. The rankings were rigged, and there was actually congressional intervention where some um, politicians from Massachusetts, Senator Kennedy, Ted Kennedy, and the House Speaker at the time, Tip O'Neill, both from Boston, were big Marvin Hagler fans, and they went to Bob Arum and they said, "Look, our guy has to get a title shot, or we're going to blow the lid off the corruption in boxing." And nobody wanted to see that. So eventually, Arum went to Goody and Pat and got Marvin his title fight, and he fought Vito Antuofermo in Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas, and that's another whole chapter.
How close was Hagler to fighting Carlos Monzon? Were there actually discussions about that fight?
I'm not 100% sure on that. I think Monzon was he Marvin. I, did he fight Griffith? I think he fought Griffith. I think he fought Emil Griffith. But I think Monzon was far too old when Marvin was turned pro.
Mhm.
I think Monzon was done in like 73. He was already done, I believe. I could be wrong.
Yeah, I think Monzon, let me think. Monzon retired in 77. And obviously, I don't know I can't remember who Hagler was fighting then, but obviously, he's still
Yeah,
on
so Marvin he wasn't ready for that at that point. He was
the.
still fighting in New England at that time. His first big fight really was at the Spectrum against Boogaloo Watts,
Mhm.
which he lost, and in Philadelphia. I think that was 1976, I believe.
Okay, okay.
So Marvin
So,
was not yet a contender at that time with Monzon.
so was it 79? He fought, he had his first world title fight against Vito
Yes,
Atafama?
it was 1979, and they went out there and they fought at Caesar's Palace, and it was a good fight. I think I believe it went the distance, and everyone thought Marvin won. In fact, the judge was Richard Steele, Hall of Fame referee, and Richard Steele went over to Goody and Pat after the bell rang and had everybody move out of the way. Said, I want to be here so when I raise Marvin's hands, the cameras can see me." So Richard Steele thought Marvin won, and when the decision came back, it went to Antifermo.
Okay. That was on the undercard of it, was it Sugar Ray Leonard versus Wilfred Benitez, I believe?
That's right. That's right. It was funny. It was a middleweight title fight, and it was the undercard to a Sugar Ray Leonard welterweight fight. But it was a huge moment for Marvin. He lost the fight, and it was another decision that he feels like he was robbed, and most people seem to agree that it was a terrible decision. It was a very lopsided decision, split decision, 2-1, and the one judge that tipped it, it was very lopsided, very didn't seem like a very honest assessment of the fight. It was very different than the other two judges' scorecards. Um, After that, Marvin was promised a rematch, and he didn't get it. Instead, Britain's fighter Alan Minter got that title shot against Vito Antuofermo.
Yeah, and obviously Minter beat him as well. I think that was Caesar's Palace as well. So before he fought Minter and after he fought Antifermo, who did Hagler fight in the meantime?
He fought some local fights. There was no one of consequence really. They were all kind of just tune-up fights really, waiting to get his title shot again. And he thought he was going to get it against Antifermo, but he didn't. That fight went to Alan Minter, and then Minter beat Antifermo. Marvin fought a couple more times, and then finally Marvin got his chance at the title again against Alan Minter.
So that fight was at Wembley Arena in London.
That's right.
How close was that to being made in America? Because I would have thought, especially back then, America was the epicenter of boxing. So when I first saw the fight, I thought, oh, it's a bit of a surprise that it's. I know he's a champion, but I thought it would have been outbid the for the fight show. The fight could be in America because I think it was a mandatory defense from Minter as well.
Yep.
So how close was that fight being made in America?
I don't think very close because I think to your point with the promoters, Mickey Duff was Alan Minter's promoter for that fight, and Mickey Duff had a lot of juice, certainly in Europe. And back then there was a lot of the title fights, especially in the lower weight classes, were in Europe. And England hadn't had a champion before Alan Minter. There was no world boxing champion in England. I think the last one before that was I can't remember the name, but it had been several decades, been 30, 40 years. So I think the boxing world wanted that fight to be in England. Alan Minter and obviously Mickey Duff fought for it. And Marvin Hagler did not have the draw and the name recognition at the time to be a big Vegas draw. So I think Arum and everybody else was fine with the fight being in England, but it turned out to be a really horrific event all around in many ways. And certainly it wasn't good for Alan Minter.
Did Hagler miss the weight the first time of asking, I believe?
He did, yeah. So that's a great part of the book. I talk about the weigh-in was something all to itself. And Marvin and Goody and Pat thought there was some shenanigans going on. I'm not sure if there was or not, but you can actually watch that weigh-in on YouTube. And Marvin was like half a pound overweight, and they gave him, I think, 3 hours to make weight, and he had to go and cut weight however he did and jump and rope, whatever he did. And then he came back out and he was in just his jock strap, and they had to clear the room and make all the ring card girls in the room, and they had to make everyone leave the room so Marvin could be weighed in his jock strap. And he just made weight exactly by 160.
Cool. So the next part of that, in the lead up to it, there's this whole thing with Minter saying an interview, and he said, "I'm not going to let a black man take the title from me," and so on and so forth. Which already fueled a lot of what happened. And then you had like the National Front, which is like this far right group. A lot of them came into the arena as well. Alcohol flowing, and even from watching that fight, no matter honestly, you can tell from the atmosphere already. You think this isn't great, so to speak, and that turned out to be the case.
Yeah, so I was able to, a lot of the folks are no longer with us, unfortunately, Marvin and Alan Minter, but I talked to a lot of people that were at that fight for this book, including members of Alan Minter's family, members of Marvin Hagler's entourage and their families, and everyone really reported, and journalists that were there as well that are still alive, and everyone was pretty clear that there was a lot of tension in the air at that fight, and it felt like something bad was going to happen. And a lot of it was attributed to the amount of drinking that was going on. Now, the British folks, including Alan Minter's family, will tell you that there was a soccer match before the game. I think it was Tottenham was playing, and Liverpool, I believe,
Okay.
I believe, and a lot of the hooligans that were at that game made their way into the fight afterwards because Tony Simpson also fought on that card, who was a big British fighter. And I guess apparently a lot of the fans from those soccer teams were also fans of Tony Simpson. Regardless of who was fans of who, the fact is that the drinking commenced. There was a in England at the time, as you know, as a Brit who studied history, there was a lot of uh, debate, controversy, tension, and racial strife in London and England at the time. There was a lot of um, fighting over immigration,
Yeah.
and this wasn't white immigration; it was black immigration, and there was a lot of violence that had unfolded. So that's kind of the backdrop of this fight was that all this stress and tension was going on, and then Alan Minter makes this comment, and a lot of those fans um, agreed with Alan Minter. They felt they wanted that. They didn't want to see a black man come into England and take the British world champions title. So it was a perfect storm for what ended up happening. But Marvin Hagler, I like to say the reason I wrote this book is because he didn't talk about these issues a lot. He wasn't a big political guy, but really his actions spoke far louder than any words could ever speak because he did go into that fight after fighting all that corruption in the United States in the boxing industry for so many years and gets put into this powder keg of a situation against a guy who's kind of a hero to the far right National Front. and just eviscerates him, beats the living shit out of him, and wins the title. To me, and to a lot of people here in America, I think will agree that Marvin really was an unlikely sort of civil rights hero, um, because of his actions.
Yeah, watching that fight from a tactical point of view, I felt Minter's tactics were all wrong because he did the one thing he shouldn't do against Hagler, which is he came right forward at him.
Mm,
And obviously in that southpaw stance and obviously switch on how it was, and obviously Minter's very upright, as good as fighter is. Yeah,
mm,
Hagler, and be susceptible to cuts as well. Hagler just cut his face, and it
yeah.
was surprising when his corner stopped the fight.
Well, they were both switch fighters. They could both fight either way, southpaw or traditional, and they would often switch up either one. And Alan Minter had a lot of problems throughout his career with cuts, and it ended up costing him in this fight because, as you said, he brought the fight to Marvin, and Marvin talked about it later in his career. And after the fight, he said he's very surprised that Alan Minter came right at him and brought the fight right to him. It was exactly what Marvin wanted because that's how Marvin liked to fight. Was if he wanted to fight, he was going to fight. And he took, Marvin just took advantage of it and just peppered him, and the fight was over in 3 rounds with Alan Minter bleeding profusely and ultimately needing plastic surgery. It should have been a great night for Marvin Hagler, but it ended poorly. If you want me to get into that.
Yeah, so Hagler, the three stops the fight. Hagler's on his knees. And then all of a sudden, there's this hail of beer bottles and glasses coming down. And I've actually heard a commentary on both of both the American and British commentary. So you got Howard Carpenter saying someone has landed on him, and then Howard Cosell has come from I think it's ABC at the time. Same
Yep.
thing happened. And then you had all the police coming to the ring and literally have to carry him off almost like a shield around him.
Yeah.
And then again, from what I read, well, first of all, they had to interview him in the changing rooms because they couldn't interview him outside like you would traditionally do.
Mm.
But wasn't there a case when they actually managed to get out the back of the arena, they got into a car? Didn't someone throw something at the car and window got smashed? Is that correct?
Yeah, the windows of the limousine or whatever vehicle they were in was smashed. Marvin's family was in the vehicle, and some of the family members told me about that and how scary that was. There was a riot outside. It was a lot of fighting. Police were arresting people. It turned into bedlam, and the windows were smashed on the car. They eventually made it back to the hotel. They got out of the arena. But you're right. The worst part was Marvin Hagler went through that journey, wins the fight, and should have been his great moment of becoming world champion, but instead he gets run out of the ring and goes back to the hotel, and he never got his belt until he got back into America. They had to mail it back to him. He didn't get his belt when he was in England.
So what was his first defense after beating Minter?
So he came back to America and came back to Brockton, had a huge victory parade and was celebrated like a hero. That's really when Marvin Hagler, um, the Marvelous name really took off, where he became a huge celebrity at that point. The pictures from the violence that happened after the fight they went international, and it's a very iconic photo of everybody surrounding Marvin, um, when the bottles are being thrown. So I think that really elevated his celebrity. So at that point, Bob Arum and the rest of them are very smart, and they gave him a rematch against Vito Antuofermo, and that was at Boston Garden, and I was actually at that fight. I was 10 years old. I was a little kid, but my dad was a big fight fan, and he brought me to that fight, and I remember it like it was yesterday. Marvin won the fight. I can't remember what round it was, but the fight was stopped because Antuofermo was just gushing blood from a massive cut across his forehead. Like Alan Minter, Vito Antuofermo struggled with cuts his whole career as well, and it ended it for him.
Didn't Antifermo's trainer get into the ring after the first round because he felt that Hagler was fouling Antifermo? Is that correct?
I don't remember that. You might be right though, but he definitely had his trainer was known to be a pretty excitable, fiery guy. But yeah, but they stopped the fight, and it was in Boston Garden, and again that's what really, when Marvin's legend started to build, and everyone realized that he wasn't just a decent fighter or a good fighter. He was a great fighter, and had the potential to be one of the greats, and he turned out to be.
So then he has these title defenses, and he nicknamed himself Marvelous, but the networks weren't using that. So then
Yep.
Hagler's lawyer had a unique way of making sure that the networks actually had to say his name.
Yeah, so Marvin, was angry because he was given the nickname Marvelous Marvin Hagler when he was young, fighting amateur, um, and he tried to have the ring announcer say it and all that, and no one would. And he said, "Well, you say Sugar Ray Leonard, you say Boogaloo Watts. Why won't you say Marvelous Marvin Hagler?" And no one gave him an answer. Howard Cosell wouldn't say it. So his attorney, Steve Wainwright, was a very interesting character, very flashy barrister. And Steve Wainwright said, "Hey, why don't you let's change your name legally to Marvelous Marvin Hagler." So he went into Brockton City Hall and he changed his name to Marvelous Marvin Hagler, had it legally changed, and to this day that's his name.
Um, so then, in terms of his first mega fight, we're getting, I think it's around 1982 or three, due to fight Duran. And it's a bit of a weird fight in a sense because obviously Duran's gone from lightweight, welterweight, had an issue with the second fight with Len No Mass, but then beats Davey Moore. But then the fight happens, and the fight happens because of an advert they're both in. Is that correct? That's when it starts happening.
I'm sorry, because of what?
Because of they both starred in an advert, from what I've heard, and then the promoters realised actually they look the same height, they look actually similar in size. So let's make a fight about them. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think I think at that time, the best fighters on the planet were really Sugar Ray Leonard, Marvin Hagler, and Roberto Duran. Roberto Duran had a reputation as being one of the toughest fighters out there. So Marvin had beat pretty much everybody in the middleweight division. Guys like John Mugabe, who was a very tough fighter, Mustafa Hamsho, who I interviewed for my book, and folks like that. So he had to look outside his weight class to really get those big paydays, and that's how it was decided that he would fight Hearns. And I'm sorry, Roberto Duran, and then the same thing kind of eventually happened with Hearns and Leonard. But they were all, Hearns was a lot taller than the rest of them, but they were all similarly sized. And, as you know, being a boxing guy, 5 or 10 pounds can make a big difference on someone's frame, but a great boxer can really train themselves to add that weight without changing their style or their speed. And that's what guys like Roberto Duran and Sugar Ray Leonard were able to do. Marvin never had to change weight divisions. They all came to him. But that's because he was the man to beat.
Yeah, yeah. The Duran fight was interesting because up until the last three rounds, it was actually very close, and I think Duran was leading on a couple of scorecards going the last three
Yes.
rounds.
Yeah, there's a lot of people that thought Duran would have won that fight, but Marvin was able to pull it together. Duran fought a great fight, but Marvin, I think, was just the better fighter that night. And I don't think anyone ever disagrees with that decision. But I think if Duran had won maybe one or two more rounds, it might have gone the other way.
And then he fought, I think it was afterwards, he fought Tony Simpson.
Yeah, that's
Um,
right.
and correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't there a situation where, okay, the fight happens in the arena, but it was actually snowing outside, so there was a low attendance in the arena, is that correct?
I'm not sure if that. I didn't research that fight too much for this book, but I do remember that my dad was at that fight. He didn't bring me to that one. It was in Worcester, Massachusetts, which is a big city in the middle of Massachusetts, and there was a huge blizzard that night. So there was a lot of that back then. There was some fights that Marvin fought up in Portland, Maine, early in his pro career, some huge fights that should have had big gates, and there was only 1,000 or so people there because there were big snowstorms.
Mm-mm.
That's New England for you.
Well, yeah, indeed, indeed. And I've seen that Tony Simpson fight, and I have to say, of all the fights I've seen of Hagler's, that's the most impressive. Because Simpson, of course, for those who don't know, a year after Hagler beat Minter, Minter actually ended up retiring after being stopped by Tony Simpson. So, and he was like the number one contender as well, Simpson at the time. So it was a big fight, but Hagler absolutely just broke him down in I think it was 6 rounds.
Yeah. Hagler, after beating Alan Minter, he was pretty unstoppable in almost every one of his fights. Duran's the only one that came close to really giving him a good fight in those first, 3, 4, 5 years that he was the champion. He just really beat a lot of tough guys, and he ended a lot of boxers' careers, including Alan Minter. Really, that was Alan Minter never really fought of much consequence after that. He was not the same person after he lost to Marvin Hagler.
So again, obviously we talk a lot about Hagler's career, but in terms of his marriage and whatnot, how was that? Again, how is that developing? Because Hagler's becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. And you hear stories, not just in boxing, but in any form of entertainment, where if one partner gets bigger and there's more scrutiny, then it can put a strain on the marriage. So, how is
Mhm.
Hagler's family life at this point?
In those early days, it was good. When like Bertha was with him at the Minter fight, and she was there a lot. She was in his training camp a lot, and they had a family. She had two kids from a previous relationship, and then they had a son together, Champ, Marvin Jr. And they were building their own family. And in those early days, they had, by all accounts, pretty good marriage, and they were happy. But as the money came and more responsibility, more pressure, and Marvin had bigger and bigger fights. Certainly, the stress and tension increased on their marriage. But she became pretty well known as well. She started doing interviews, and Don King would talk to Bertha, and Don King was trying to get Marvin to leave the Petronellis and go work with him. So there was a lot of pressure on the family, I think. But the people that I spoke to and that I really knew Marvin, um, are very clear that he was a family man and he really loved family. He loved his siblings. He loved his kids, whether they was biological kids or not, and he loved to help other people. And that was a trait that he kept until the end of his life. Um, Even after his marriage to Bertha ended, after he retired, he moved to Italy, and he found a new love of his life, his wife Kay, and they had a great marriage. They were madly in love, and I think till the end of his life, he really valued that family structure that he could have, because he didn't really have it when he was a little kid.
Yeah, indeed. Wasn't his love of Italy, didn't it start because of one of his title defenses, was in Italy, I believe?
He did have a title defense in Italy, but I think after he retired, he knew he loved the country, Italy, and I think after the Leonard fight, where the decision was in, will forever be disputed. Everyone here in Boston obviously thinks that he won the fight, including me, or at the very least, it was a draw, and he should not have lost his title. That's kind of what I think, but. Um, he just didn't want to be around boxing anymore. I think it was the last straw. He was disgusted with the sport. He was disgusted with the Vegas sort of machine that could make or break a fighter. And he didn't want to deal with the press and the constant questions. So he moved to another country and he chose Italy and he built a new life there. And that's when he met Kay. And they once he met her, he was an Italian. He was ready to stay. And he did. He built himself a nice life over there.
And he actually, because I've heard him speak it, he actually learned the language very quickly as well.
He did, and he became a film star over there. He starred in some action movies, kind of like Arnold Schwarzenegger style movies. And he really loved it. He did still keep a house here in New England. He had a house up in the mountains in New Hampshire, and he would come back a lot, and he'd have family up, and Goody and Pat Petronelli would come visit him and things like that. But he really loved his life in Italy with Kay.
So the Hearns fight, 19, April 1985, but it should have happened a couple of years before, but Hearns injured his finger.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, they were supposed to fight before, but Hearns had to postpone it, and then they rescheduled it in 1985. And we all know what happened there. It was one of the greatest fights ever, really. They call it three of the greatest rounds in boxing history.
Indeed, and still fight that's 40 years old this year now because it's still talked about. I remember the first time I watched that fight, I'd heard all the stories and then I managed to get a video of it, and I could not believe the intensity of it. It was
Yeah.
crazy, but that was really the fight. Even though people respected how that was really the fight. I think cemented transcended him outside of boxing. Those 3 rounds.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think, remember at that time, Hearns was looked at as unbeatable. He was looked at as one of the toughest men on the planet at the time, and so was Marvin. So they were two fighters at the top of their game, in their prime, on the biggest stage in the world. And at the time, it was the biggest gate any pro fight had ever seen, even bigger than heavyweight fights. It was just a huge, huge spectacle. Remember too that this was the days of, cable TV was just starting and closed circuit boxing. There was no 24-hour cable, no internet, none of that stuff. So all eyes were on the sport at that time. The middleweight division at that time had the best fighters, and it was really a huge, huge news event globally. And for Marvin to come out of that winning, not only winning, but winning the way he did, just during an absolute slugfest, he became a global celebrity. He's, a household name.
Yeah, indeed. And then the year after, he fought again after the delay because I think Hagler injured. I don't think it was his knee, but he fought John Mugabe, who again was a number one contender. And it's a fight which brilliant fight. If anyone hasn't watched it, I'd recommend they do. But you can see Hagler starting to slow down after all those fights. Would that be accurate to say?
You know, I I think that Mugabe fight was a tough fight. John Mugabe was a tough, tough guy, and a lot of people will, a lot of boxing folks will tell you that he was actually the toughest guy that Marvin ever fought. That John the Beast Mugabe was his name, and um, but Marvin was getting older at that point too. And he was the champion, and as every champion experiences, sometimes maybe you don't have the hunger like you did, and you don't train as hard as you did when you had nothing. It's kind of a, it's the common sort of narrative, Rocky 3, that's why
Mm-hmm.
Clubber Lang beat Rocky, because Rocky was too comfortable being champion and Clubber Lang wanted it more. But I wouldn't say Marvin was, his talents were still very sharp at that point, and he was still in shape, as much as anyone. But I think had that fight happened 2 or 3 years earlier, I think Marvin might have beat him a lot easier.
Mm, indeed. Just quickly, what you talk about toughness, and Hagler was well known for his chin.
Mm.
Is it true that they had some tests at hospitals at X-ray, and they found out his temples were like the double the thickness of like what the average temple thickness should be, and that's what basically helped him absorb the punches.
That's new for me. I haven't heard that one. I don't know the answer to that, but that's interesting if it's true.
Yeah, that's what I've heard anyway. I can't remember why he had the test, but the temple region, he's got double the thickness of normal, and hence why he could absorb so many punches as
I
well.
mean, Goody Petronelli often talked about his chin and said that, boxers either have a chin or they don't, and Marvin did. And he said he had one of the best chins that he ever saw in his career. And certainly, you watch his fights, Marvin didn't win fights by avoiding getting punched. He won fights, because he fought and he got punched a lot. He did have great defense. He was a great defensive boxer and a great skilled boxer, but he could take a punch.
Indeed. So after Mugabe, wasn't Hagler due to retire or thinking of retirement, and then the opportunity to fight Leonard came around?
Yeah, I think he was considering retirement at that point, and so was Sugar Ray Leonard. And Sugar Ray Leonard had actually had an incident where he had problems with his eye. He had I forget the injury, what it was called, but he almost retired because he was, you know, in jeopardy of going blind if he had kept fighting. But they put the fight together, and certainly, 1987, it was at that time it was the biggest fight that really the sport had seen. It was two great champions who were matched up at really the last minute. Um, when if it didn't happen at that moment, it would have never happened. Um, some may say maybe it shouldn't have happened, but it ended up, it was a historic fight and certainly a great fight.
Indeed. But I think, as dark as it was, because Hagler held all the belts at that point, and I think only the WBC would allow him to fight Leonard, whereas other two basically said they stripped him just before the fight. Is that correct?
That's right, and it was because of the injury to Sugar Ray Leonard, because they didn't want to be liable if he ended up going blind from the fight. And a lot of people gave Sugar Ray Leonard no chance in that fight. He was a pretty big underdog. I can't remember the numbers, but Marvin was the favored fighter in that, because of what you said. He was the undisputed middleweight champ. He was heavier, he was stronger, he was bigger. Sugar Ray Leonard had to put on weight to fight in the middleweight division. So it was a big challenge for Sugar Ray Leonard, but I think what happened, and I've heard Sugar Ray Leonard talk about this over the years. Um, he watched the Mugabe fight, and he saw how Mugabe was able to get inside and hurt Hagler, and was able to make Marvin fight a different kind of fight than he wanted to fight. And he saw something in that fight that made him think he could win, and he exploited it. And that's what happened in that fight.
Indeed. So the fight happens. Leonard wins, some say controversially. How long after that fight did Hagler think I've done with boxing? I know you talked about it before, but
Mm.
was there a chance where he wanted a rematch after it? Like how long after that fight did Hagler think I've just done with boxing?
So Marvin, I think he was done with boxing. I think after that fight, he was disgusted, but he was angry and he wanted revenge, just like he did with Darnell Wigfall. And he chased Leonard around and wanted a rematch, demanded a rematch, and he wasn't given it. Sugar Ray Leonard wouldn't do it. None of the promoters would make it happen. None of the sanctioning bodies required it. So I think that was very frustrating to Marvin, and he had enough, and that's when he said, I'm done, and he retired and he moved to Italy.
Mm. So he moves to Italy. Actually, how did him and Kay meet?
I don't know that story, to be honest with you. I believe they met in in Italy though. She's Italian, so.
Okay, okay. And how many years before then did had Hagler divorced Bertha at this point?
Yeah, so they divorced in 1990, I believe, was when they got divorced. So the fight was 87 with Leonard, and then after that, him and Bertha had some pretty severe problems. They separated for a while, and then they got divorced, and he went to Italy.
When you say severe problems, do you go into detail of that in the book?
No, so I don't. I really end the story with the Minter fight is where I kind of end it, and I have an epilogue that talks about some of the stuff we're talking about. I don't want to give away the whole book, but um, the later stuff in his career has been covered in other books, and that really wasn't my goal for this one. I wanted to focus on the early part of his career and really what made Marvin marvelous.
Okay. What happened to the Petronellis after Hagler retired? I know they trained Steve Collins, for instance, for a short period, but what else did they do after that?
They trained a lot of good fighters. They had Drake Thadze, who was a heavyweight contender, Steve Collins, obviously, and they ran the gym for several years until they got older, and they both lived well into their 80s, late 80s actually, and they both eventually passed away in the 90s, I believe, or the early 2000s. But they remained close to Marvin, even though Marvin was in Italy. They remained very close. Like I said, when he came home to his house up in the mountains in New Hampshire,
Mhm.
they would often visit him up there. He would go to Brockton and visit, and they had a very special relationship. And Marvin stayed away from the sport mostly for a lot of his retirement, but he did come back uh, for some broadcasts a few times for some big fights, and he would do some color commentary. He had a reunion with Alan Minter at one point where they met and they shook hands and kind of cleared the air over that whole mess that happened. And he kind of did the same with Sugar Ray Leonard as well. Him and Sugar Ray kind of cleared the air publicly. But I think that decision always haunted Marvin and really bothered him.
Yeah, it's because I remember when Lennox Lewis fought Hasim Rahman for the first time in South Africa. That fight it wasn't actually shown on Sky Sports. It was shown on the BBC. I think Hagler was part of a commentary team for that fight as well, from what I recall, which was a nice surprise.
Yeah, he did that from time to time for some of the big fights, and he was good at it. He was always and obviously it was always great to see him and hear him speak. But um, he didn't do a lot of it. He just did it on special fights like that.
Mm. And then I remember when how long ago was it he passed away?
He passed away in 2021.
Yeah, so 4 years ago. It's gone quick, and
Yeah, yeah,
it was a shock to tell you the truth when I heard because of all the
same.
people I thought would live to old age, especially keeping in touch. He passed away as well, and yeah, it was just a shock, an absolute shock, and
It
big
it
miss.
was very shocking, and I do some work with the city of Brockton, and the mayor and I decided that we want, after he passed away, it was right after COVID, it was in March 2021. So we wanted to do something special and have the city remember him. So we organized a big memorial for him in Brockton, and it was an incredible, incredible event. We had all sorts of world champions came. Tommy Hearns came, Bernard Hopkins came, uh, what's his name? Kevin, the boxer, the heavyweight. I can't remember his name, but
Kevin
um,
Johnson, is it?
no, 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 no. Kevin McBride. Kevin
McBride,
McBride
so yeah.
came, yep. And then Stephen A. Smith was there and Al Bernstein. So it was a really big event that, was national news around the country. It was very sad. Um, and Sugar Ray Leonard actually sent us a video that's up on YouTube. You can find that. Where Sugar Ray Leonard said some very nice words about Marvin. That was nice to hear.
Yeah, that's good. That's very good.
And then we built a statue to him. We have a nice, beautiful statue in Brockton now that honors Marvelous Marvin Hagler right next to the Petronelli gym.
Yeah, yeah, that's good. That's good. Really good to hear.
Yeah.
What's happened to that gym now? Is it taken over by another trainer or?
It's condos now. It's
Oh,
condominiums, apartments.
oh gosh, yeah.
It
See,
it was vacant though. It was a vacant building, and they did a beautiful job with it. It's actually called the Petronelli, and they have a little like a small museum in there with some of Marvin's memorabilia and memorabilia from the gym, pieces of the ring and things like that. So they preserved it pretty nice, and it's a nice use of that building.
when just very quickly, when was he elected into the International Boxing Hall of Fame?
He was put in the 90s. I believe it was like 93, 94, around that time. And he was in Italy at the time, so he came back for that.
Cool. So that's it with Marvin Hagler. Obviously, very
Yeah,
interesting. Just quickly about yourself. You've done this
sure.
book. Obviously, I'm hoping this interview gets a lot of views as a result. But what about you now? You said you've written 8 books. Have you got any plans to write any more? Do you have any ideas in your mind of what you want to do?
Yeah, sure. So, well, we are working on a movie on this book. So, the
Okay.
book, the rights to the book are have been optioned, and they're in the hands of Sam Rockwell. He's a Academy Award winning actor, producer. And Sam is very excited about the story, loves the story. So, we're working on that. So that's taking up a good amount of my time right now. But I am starting my next book, and I was a crime writer for many years. I was a crime reporter, and I've done several true crime books about different cases over the years. So I'm actually working on my next book right now about the Karen Reed case here in Massachusetts. It's a woman who's accused of backing over her police officer boyfriend during a snowstorm and taking off. But there's all these allegations that maybe someone else did the murder, that someone else may have beaten the police officer up. So it's a very hotly disputed case that's on TV every day here in Massachusetts and all around the country, really. So, and it's actually a lot of interest in England too. The Daily Mail covers it almost every day. So, it's one of
Okay.
those high profile murder cases. So, I'm writing a book about that. That'll come
Oh,
out next year.
cool. If people want to find out more about your work, where can I go to?
Sure, they can find me on Facebook, just Dave Wedge, Dave, not David, or they can find me on Instagram at David M Wedge, at David M Wedge. Yep.
Cool. Dave, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. It's been really enjoyable to about this topic. Thank you for coming on to the 286 Project podcast.
Sure. Great. Thanks for having me.